Welcome to DEntreviews. Today I'm going to be doing a review of the Tanchjim Hana. It may not be how you say it. It could be Tanchjim Hana for all I know, but I'm going to go with that because that's the best I got. Thanks to Mark over at Super Review again for loaning me an earphone like this. He knows that I'm into that linear studio quality type sound, and he thought I might be interested in this. So he sent it over, and he was right. It's a very good earphone. I'll kind of go over the build like I normally do before I get into the sound discussion. It's a stainless steel case, I think. It's called Piano Key White. It almost looks like an enamel or something. It's kind of a nice look if you're into bright white earphones. It's got the Tanchjim girl there, angel, whatever that is. It's got Hana written on the other piece. They both have their ear designation written on them, left and right. It's got a 2-pin, I think it's a 0.78 millimeter 2-pin connector, kind of like most earphones, Moondrop, things like that. This is not the stock cable, so I won't go into discussion about that. It is 32 ohm impedance, and it is less than 0.2% total harmonic distortion, THD. Although I take that with a grain of salt, because a lot of the measurements like that don't really mean much if they're not explained. It doesn't say at what frequency it was measured at, and da-da-da. So it's still probably, from what I can tell and how it sounds, it's very low distortion. It's 110 decibel sensitivity. It's about a 3-foot cable, I think. So that's basically the design aspect of it. The driver is interesting. It's an LCP diaphragm, which that's a liquid crystal polymer. I've seen that used in a lot of dynamic drivers. What that is the driver itself, the diaphragm is made of a material that's basically hard and light. So what that does is prevent resonation or resonance in the earphone, and it allows the driver diaphragm to move very quickly and stop suddenly, so it can have a very precise motion. So that's just their technology they're claiming is so great about this. Most have, you know, some proprietary thing in there, whatever. It's a great driver. I'll tell you why in a minute. That's basically the physical design. You can see here, if I take the tip off, it's got the filter in there. And then you have the ear tips, pretty standard ear tip. And it's comfortable. It's not very heavy. It's metal, so you can feel it, but it's by no means like heavy. It's not as heavy as the JVC FTX01, for instance. The shape is very nice. It fits my ear comfortably. I don't get any contact points on any of the edges, so I can wear these indefinitely, and they don't cause me any discomfort. They block a decent amount of sound, which is good, and they're not too large. They're not the smallest thing ever, but they're not too bad. They fit comfortably, and they sound great. So there's a bass port there and there as well, just so you can see that. So how do they sound? You know me, that's what I care about. Well, I would say that these are one of the best dynamic drivers I've ever heard, as well as one of the most neutral in terms of frequency response. That doesn't mean they're necessarily the best I've ever heard, although they're definitely high up on the list. But let's get into it here. You know me, we're going to draw some pictures. Let's do this. It's art time with DEntreviews. So, just looking at the frequency response graph here. What I'll do soon is I'm going to link here for you, dent.reviews. Go to that site. That's my new site. Boom. I have a graph tool on there, and you can actually see the IEMs that I'm measuring. Thanks again to Mark for setting that up with me and getting it running. So that has all my measured IEMs. You can check out the responses and compare them, and it's a new tool. It's good. I'll probably in the future start implementing somehow a high-tech way of showing you this stuff, but for now I'm going to draw. So the Hana is a little bit of an emphasized bass, although I would consider it well within the neutral kind of natural studio response. The mids are flawless. I mean, the mids and low mids of this earphone are just tremendously transparent and flawless. I love it. The treble rises up like it should, and then what happens is there's a little bit of a hump at 2 to 3 kilohertz, and then again at about 4 to 8 kilohertz, somewhere in there. So a little just like up and down kind of thing going on there. And then in the upper treble, around 10 to 12 kilohertz, I think, there's a slight peak. So that's the overall frequency response. From a perfect natural response, you know, yeah, you might be able to lower the bass a tiny bit. And then if you could slightly smooth out these treble bumps here and get rid of that peak, you'd have a perfect response. But it's one of the closest I've heard to what I consider a perfect response. One other thing I will mention, though, and I'm about to have one soon that I'll measure and I'll compare, but the Oxygen actually has a better treble response. It basically looks like the Hana with those two peaks smoothed and possibly a slightly improved peak up top. Bass is hard to tell. I've seen graphs of others where the bass is identical to the Hana. I've had one set of Oxygen before, and I had actually a little bit more of a bass shelf. So mine had a little bit warmer and overall thicker sound to it, which was good. It was very neutral, very smooth treble, but it just didn't have the energy and the transparency that I wanted from the bass response. So something to consider. I'll let you know once I get the next set and kind of measure them and give a comparison. So here's the sound field, and what I'll do here is just show you kind of how it sounds in a technical sense and the experience that I have when I listen to them. They're not the widest things I've ever heard, but they're fairly wide. They have a good left to right imaging. Instruments are very well distinct, and you can easily distinguish one from another. They're clear, they're precise, and they're spaced apart nicely. Sort of like etymotic, I'd argue that these are a little bit flat. And I don't mean that in a negative sense necessarily. This depends on your subjective preference. But instead of being super encompassing all around your head, they're kind of like on a field in front of you. That's kind of how the etymotics are. The instruments are clear and they're separated, but it almost has the impression that you're listening to something more in front of you than you are that's in your head or around you. It almost looks like a face. Anyway, so that's kind of how they sound. The depth, like from, if this is someone's head, obviously, from the back to the front is pretty good. The way I would describe these in almost every technical aspect is that they're very good, they're above average, and they're very natural. But in no aspect is anything exceptionally exaggerated or is any aspect of the sound heightened or hyped up. A lot of earphones that you'll see scoop up the mid-treble and then add a little bump above it like that. And what that does, it's a very common trick that a lot of earphones and manufacturers use, is it gives us a heightened sense of depth. It kind of gives the sense that the space of the recording that you're listening to has more depth and spaciousness. It's not necessarily as accurate. That's a subjective thing as well, probably. But in terms of pure tonal response and mimicking a studio monitor speaker, which I believe should be the goal of an earphone if that's your aim, is to get an accurate representation of the music. That doesn't need to be your aim, but if it is, then I think that's the goal. Well, in that regard, scooping out like that isn't really truly the most neutral and natural sound, but it would kind of enhance or give a heightened sense of depth, maybe at the cost of a slight bit of accuracy. The Hana doesn't do that. In fact, it has the extra humps there, and what that does is it actually gives the overall treble, and the lower treble specifically, sort of a cold, hard sound, and I don't really know how to describe that. The best way I can do it is just to say, if this was what it sounded like to knock on wood, that would be normal. Listening to the Hana would be closer to this, instead of... So you have a little softness there and a little hardness here. That lower treble response of the Hana gives things a quality of being kind of hard and cold and kind of forward. And I don't know really how else to describe that other than that, so I'll leave it at that. So technically, they're very competent. They have good imaging and depth and sense of natural timbre. The dynamic driver has a very good timbre. The textural quality, the fine details and instruments are easily heard. There's a lot of dead, black, silent background. There's no hiss on anything I've used them on. They're fairly easy to drive. They're just very technically competent. The single dynamic driver does a phenomenal job. It's very well tuned with an out of the world frequency response, really. Even though it's not perfect, from low to mid to high, the tonal balance of each section is very good, almost perfect. And other than those small deviations in the treble, it really is very linear. I think its biggest downfall, and what will keep most people from finding it to be the favorite or the best earphone they've heard, is that it's not very energetic or exceptionally 3D or holographic in sort of a heightened sense. So it's not as engaging maybe to some people because the sound is a little bit more flat. Natural, mind you, but maybe just flatter, more in front of you, more smooth. Whereas some people prefer to hear more dynamic energy and transparent and things jumping out at you and more in the head or around the head experience. This isn't going to give you those things. Now, with a good appreciation of well-recorded music, you might absolutely love these, or the Oxygen for that matter. And what I mean is if you have a good recording that is dynamic and well-recorded and well-balanced in the mix, these things represent it well and it's going to sound phenomenal. If you have a modern recording where the dynamics are compressed and it's not mixed really well and it's kind of dull sounding, these are going to make it sound the way it sounds, which is dull and lifeless. So unfortunately, the truth is most music, especially modern music, isn't really superbly recorded or mastered. So I'm not saying it's bad, it's just it's not as good as some of the older recordings from the 70s or 80s that were a lot more well mixed and more dynamic. And what that means is this earphone may not excel at those types of genres in that modern music. So if you listen to a lot of music that isn't maybe the best mastering, you might be disappointed with these because they might just sound a little bit less than energetic and less than hyper 3D that you like. And you might want to go with another earphone. It's like the Dunu EST112 even. While that's still in the neutral vein, I think it pulls out those micro details and things jump out at you a little bit more while still sounding almost warmer and more inviting. It's a very interesting earphone, which I'll do another review on. So I don't want to give this a knock. It's a phenomenal earphone, and I think it's going to appeal to people who like sort of the edemotic type quality, like the ER4 series. ER4 XR maybe is the closest to this, and things like that. It's probably not going to appeal to people who like more U-shaped or V-shaped earphones, and while it does have a slight bass lift and maybe that peak up high that kind of gives it a little of an unbalanced shape to it, it's by no means U-shaped or V-shaped. It's more aligned with the Moondrop tuning, their VST, whatever it is, kind of like an edemotic in the treble and maybe a slight Harman tilt in the bass, although it's nowhere near the current Harman level of bass. So it's kind of an odd little frequency graph here, but I think it's superb because of its linearity, how smooth it is in where it transitions from each section. And that it makes them very revealing, very natural in tonality and timbre, and I think they're very high quality. So I'm going to just try not to reiterate myself too much, keep this kind of short, but I highly recommend these at $160. I really do think they're a phenomenal set. I think that if that's your budget and that's the type of sound you like, these are an awesome, awesome buy. And I've even read that, I haven't tested this, but if you put the Oxygen filters on the Hana, it makes the response of the treble match that of the Oxygen, which is just basically even smoothing the treble out more, so you're going to get a better sound out of that. So I would highly recommend that. If you have the Hana or you're considering getting the Hana, definitely slap the Oxygen filters on there and see how that sounds. For a step up, the Oxygen might be the right move, but let me get the new model that I'm going to get and measure them and see how they compare. But the response is a little bit smoother in the treble. A step up from that, for me personally, is the Moondrop Illumination, but that's a whole nother ball game. So for the price and the value proposition, I think these are phenomenal. So I highly recommend these, the Tanchjim Hana. And if you have any questions about them, please leave them below. And as always, check out the link here for my graph tool and everything. And thank you guys for watching.